A Traveller in Time by Alison Uttley. Chapter 6. Hasty Penelope, thy aunt calls thee. There's work waiting, and thou in the fields roaming like a boy. Thou mun make the pastry flowers and leaves for the pies and pastries, said Tabitha, beckoning me indoors. I went to the kitchen and found the great baking in progress, the preparation of food for a large household. Enormous pastries were stuffed with pigeons and larks, which Marjorie and Tabitha had prepared. Geese and capons were roasting, and Jude turned them before the fire, his eyes glancing round maliciously. I sat at the table to shape the roses and leaves out of strips of paste to trim the pies. It was my work, Dame Cicely said, and my fingers were nimble for it. Town fingers were better than country ones when it came to making ornaments, and doubtless I had seen fine devices at the pastry cook's. There was a ham baked in honey syrup and spiked with cloves, and brawn and pig's pettitoes, soused and tansy puddings. When I had finished my task, the table was cleared and scrubbed, and the servants' dinner was set, with pewter plates and a horn-handled knife apiece, and a polished drinking horn for the small ale and cider. I looked around for the forks, but saw none, and Aunt Cicely was surprised at my inquiry. Mistress Babington had a silver fork, and so had Master Anthony, but we used our fingers, and so did Master Francis. What were fingers given us for, she asked, if not for eating? Forks were a newfangled habit from the Italians, and not for honest Englishmen. I sat down to the table, for I was very hungry, and the good smells of roasting and baking meats filled the air. I ate first some solid white pudding, heavy with lumps of fat, which I carefully removed. "You're too pernickety," cried Dame Cicely. "London living spiled you for wholesome victuals." But secretly I dropped scraps on the rushes for the dogs to eat. On the same plate I had a wedge of pastry stuff, with pigeon and herbs and chopped apple. I ate this with my fingers, like the others. Aunt Cicely, Tabitha, Marjorie, and a thin-faced girl called Moll. The men sat at a long trestle table, and I was glad, for their manners were uncouth, and they spat out the food they did not like. The drinking horns were filled with ale, made in the brewhouse across the yard from our own barley. There was honey mead for those who wanted it, but I wished for water. I knew where the spring was, for I had often filled the kettle for Aunt Tissy, and I ran out now with a leather jug. On my way, I passed a small room where a spinning wheel clacked, and a girl sat turning the wheel and spinning the wool. She nodded and smiled, and I went to her. She touched my dress and wondered at its smoothness of texture, and asked if my mother had spun the wool and dyed it in Chelsea. I said we had bought it in a shop. "Ah, on London Bridge. I've seen the water of the Thames swirling under the arches, and I've been to the shops on the bridge. My name is Phoebe Drury, and I was born at Bow, but I've been in service here for 10 years. Tell me, Penelope, have you seen the Queen? They say she has a dress for every day of the year, and her stomachers are stiff with pearls and rubies." I confessed I hadn't, although I had heard of the richness of her dress. Then I went out for the water, which came bubbling from the spring, in crystal coils jutting from the ground. As I sipped the earthy coldness of it, cupping it in my hand, I was aware once more of the continuity of life, as if I were part of events past, present, and to come, and I could choose my way among them. They were all talking when I returned, telling tales of magic and wonders, of fire-eaters and performing animals, speaking of a bear led by a warder which danced at Derby Fair, and a horse which talked at Nottingham Goose Fair. Yes, they said, the horse could tell the hour like the night watchman, and it pawed the name of Queen Bess. The serving men were leaning back, drinking from their horns, joining in the discourse. They spoke of Master Anthony, how he was visiting the farms on his estates, collecting his dues, paying wages owed, hearing complaints, and being well received, because his manner was affable, and no conceit or arrogance. He was going hunting in the great woods which stretched across the hills, and the huntsmen were to meet at a little manor hidden in the woods. There was new life coming to Thacker's, they said, for the news of his homecoming had spread, and peddlers came with many-coloured ribbons and laces, coifs and silks, men who had been with gewgaws to Sheffield Castle. Dame Cicely had bought a bunch of ribbon that morning, and Mistress Babington had chaffered for a silver lacing and tassels of gold for her dress. Songwriters had ballads to please him, and presents were arriving for his birthday. Then the old shepherd, seated at the men's table, spoke up in quavering, high-pitched tones. "There ain't no good coming here. There's evil abroad. I seen a comet in the heavens when I was a minding sheep, and it bodes no good. Something harmful's coming," said he mournfully. "Young Mester won't bide here. Where he was born and bred he won't bide. Stars are agin him." "He's going to Paris, that city of Satan," said another, and the old shepherd shook his head. "He won't bide here," he repeated, "and there's a comet in the sky." All clever noblemen go to Paris, and Rouen, where there is much learning. There's no harm. Be silent, cried Dame Cicely shortly. But the aged shepherd would not be silenced, and he mumbled on. It's for the Queen of Scotland's sake, and I don't know hold with her. She's in league with the Spaniards, and they're utterly destroy us, like flax in the fire. I remember things you young folk forget. I remember tales of fire and burning in Queen Mary's reign. Those bloody days will come again if Spain gets here. Aye, we shall all be consumed like flax in the flames. Master Anthony wouldn't agree to that, said another, for he loves his land, but he says the Scottish Queen should be set free. True, said Dame Cicely, so she should, for she'll be Queen of England some day, and Master Anthony will be rewarded. If she doesn't die in prison first, said Tabitha. I heard she was ill and like to die a time back. The Scottish Queen is a murderess. She's the Scarlet Woman, shouted a young man with a fierce dark face. She plotted with Bothwell to blow up her husband, and the Scots wouldn't have her. She shall never be Queen of England. Several sprang to their feet, crying out on him and seizing him. Such a hubbub arose that Dame Cicely was in a fine to-do, shaking her hands and crying out to be silent, the mistress would hear. Blows were struck and blood flowed, and dishes were overturned, for loyalties divided the house, and some were for one and some for another, although I could see that all were for Master Anthony and his kindred. I slipped out of the room, filled with dismay, and I ran along the passage, past the still room with its odors of simples, past the spinning room where Phoebe cried out to know what was the matter, but I didn't stop. I was seeking someone, looking for a dear, familiar face, a warm hand to hold, a voice to bring courage. I crossed the panelled hall, where I had never been before. I caught a sight of the great sword and longbow hanging on the wall. They had belonged to Thomas Babington, who fought at Agincourt with King Henry V. Mistress Folsham had told me. They hung on either side of the crest. Foi et tu, faith is all, I read, and I stopped for a minute to look up at the words which I had seen in the church, and I whispered them to myself as I climbed the oak staircase. Below me, at the end of the room, sat Anthony and his family. Frances caught the flash of my skirt as I turned the corner. Footsteps came after me, and I hurried along the passage, past the door of Mistress Folsham's room. Through a crack I could see the walls with their painted beasts and birds, but I went on. I felt that I had to get away, or I might never reach those I sought. I passed other doors, each with carved fruit at the lintel, and I came to the steps at the end. I ran softly up, my feet making no noise, my step light as air. Everywhere was silent, quiet as a dreamless sleep. The footsteps had died away. No one could find me. I lifted the latch and walked through to the landing I knew so well. The air was different. The smells were homely, odors of primroses and fresh linen, for the oak chest was open, and a clothes basket full of sheets lay near. I had left the spiced and rich life behind me in summer's heat to return to the cooler days of spring. I looked at my watch. Its fingers had not moved. The inexorable hours, the racing minutes were fused into one bright second into which I had gone undiscovered, sharing the ether with those unseen ones, breathing their rare atmosphere, living a life heightened by danger, returning with a dim memory of these things. I looked at myself in the little mirror. My cheeks were flaming red, my arms were sunburnt, but another sun had warmed them. The hot passions of those days flowed in my veins. I felt transfigured, old, wise, knowing 1,000 things of which I had been barely conscious. Strangely moved by the knowledge that I was separated from that life by only the thinnest vapor, I went downstairs, my little watch ticking the minutes away, awakened from its sleep. As I became accustomed to this journey in time and this transformation of scene, I found myself remembering less of the present. I became more absorbed in the past through my love for those whom I met there. Yet I knew there was a possibility I might not come back, and it was this knowledge which later on tainted my experience with fear. Sometimes I must have made the journey unknown to myself when I slept, for they were not surprised at my reappearances. They evidently expected me. I, who had always been a dreamer, seldom awoke in the long nights at Thacker's. I lay with my head nested on the downy pillow, unmoving, till Aunt Tissy came into the room and the sunshine broke through the curtains. Perhaps I sped through time to the Elizabethans' home and shared the servitude of Dame Cicely, and returned while my body lay in that deep sleep. I brought no consciousness of my traveling. I lost all as one forgets a dream on awakening. When I went there in those flashes which I relate, I had an uneasy feeling that I had been there more often than I could remember. I was not a stranger. My feet moved unhesitatingly across the floors. I opened cupboards and presses, aware of the contents. The taste of strange dishes was palatable to my lips. I shivered as I thought of this unknown journey, for I clung to the dear familiar things of life, and I was not prepared to venture into the past unwittingly, lest I should be caught and captured forever in that time. I only went once more, knowingly, into the secret life which moved alongside our humdrum country days before we went back to London. Whenever I stood on the landing waiting for the miracle to happen, the doors I saw were those of our own rooms. The wall was solid as reality. There was no entry into the past days. It was after church on the last Sunday that I found my way there again. I sat in the Babington pew between Aunt Tissy and Alison, for Ian had refused to attend the monthly service and preferred to help Jess. Uncle Barnabas was left at home to look after the dinner. He said his duty was done without any psalm singing, for already he had rung the solitary bell, which went ding, ding, ding. I asked him where the other bells were, for in the old days there was a gay peal of 6 bells. Perhaps they had been melted down for cannon or sold by somebody in the days of poverty which came to Thacker's after Anthony Babington's death. He did not know. I thought of this as I sat in the church. Overhead were the oak rafters where a swallow flew to feed her young. Beyond I could see the carved shield with the motto, Foi et tu. Somewhere else I had seen those words, but I could not remember where. Through the windows, whose richly stained glass was now replaced by plain, the branches of the yew trees moved in the wind. Uncle Barnabas told me that villagers came to the churchyard for 100 years for their yew boughs, and the wood where we picked our bluebells was called Bow Wood because many yews once grew on its heights. I listened to the words of the parson, a dreary man who sent us all to sleep. For thine is the kingdom for ever and ever, he intoned. For ever and ever and ever, I whispered again, and a mist swam over my eyes. The village people whom I knew, the blacksmith and carpenter, the postman and schoolmaster, faded away, and another congregation was there, in wimple and kirtle and leather breeches and cloth doublet. They used the same words, for ever and ever. In the pulpit was a stern man, who scolded them severely for all their misdeeds. Timothy Daler had not paid his tithes. Adam Buckley had beaten his wife. Tom Snowball had slept during the sermon. I thought I saw Mistress Babington beside me, but Anthony was not in the square oak pew with the arms carved on the door. The air was hot and sultry. There was a strong smell of straw and birch branches under my feet. I staggered, for I could hardly breathe. Aunt Tissy caught me, and the ghostly congregation faded away. She led me across the yard back to the farm. There was dear Uncle Barnabas in the kitchen, with a monster spoon basting the roast beef. He was much concerned over my faintness. He ought to have opened the church windows, he said. Lie down and bide quiet, my child, said Aunt Tissy, and she gave me a drink of hot water and ginger. Then she peeped in the oven, for I heard the clang of the iron door as I lay in my room, and she went back to church. But through the trembling air came a whisper, Penelope! No sound at all, but the echo of some long-dead call. I rose from my bed and crept along the landing past the oak chest to the wall. My hands glided over smooth stone, and I could find no opening. From the kitchen I could hear Uncle Barnabas whistling a hymn tune, and the words came from the church over the garden. Our God, our help in ages past, they sang. Then I touched a cold latchet, and once more found myself looking into the small panelled room where I had first been a visitor. Anthony Babington was there, seeking feverishly in the oak coffer, turning papers and books. His face was pale. He muttered to himself. Without noticing me, he went to the fireplace and twisted a leaf carved in the foliage of the mantelpiece. A door swung back, a secret door which disclosed a priest's room with a crucifix on the wall. He knelt on the floor and prayed. Then he came out again, closing the panel so that the small slit of a room disappeared, its lines concealed in the walls. He saw me standing in the shadows, hesitating, for I could not return by the way I had come, and I had no wish to disturb him. Penelope Taberner, find my jewel, he cried, and he seized my hands and held them as if he feared I should fade away. My jewel! I've lost it. I can do nothing without it. You have strange power, so find it. Tell me where it is. The locket of her, of Mary Queen of Scots, I asked. He groaned. Yes, it's my talisman. It is lost. I meant to take it to Paris, and it has gone. Master Anthony, I don't know where it is, I cried in distress. But he would not believe I had no knowledge. I promised to search in fields and woods and do my best for him. If ever you find it, you will tell me. You will come and tell me, he insisted, and his blue eyes looked as fierce as a hawk's as they stared into mine. I gave my solemn promise, and left him there among his books, for I wanted to see Francis. I went down the kitchen staircase, intending to cross the alleyway by the still room. But the door of the kitchen was wide open, and a company sat round the table and sprawled on the forms listening to one who addressed them. Their talk was of the Scots Queen, for a pedlar had got a glimpse of her riding with her guard on Sheffield Moor, and a carpenter had seen her portrait. He was describing it as I passed, and I waited to hear the news. There it hung, a grand painting done by her Grace's embroider, Master Audrey. He's a Frenchman, and he makes the designs for the broideries of the Queen and her ladies. He showed it to me, and I saw it with these very eyes. How did you manage to get in? Asked Tabitha. I'd give a deal to see a portrait of her Grace. I wouldna, said another. I'd give naught at all. But they silenced him. 'Twas this way, said the first speaker. I had a small dealing with Master Audrey. I made a box to hold the skins of silk which he has. 50 little places to keep the skins separate, all in a good oak box, smooth as silk itself. It was a pretty piece of work, I may tell you, and he paid me well. He was excellently pleased with it, so I up and spoke to him. Master Audrey, says I, although I ought to have called him Monsieur Audrey. Master Audrey, says I, will you grant me a favour? I've heard tell you've painted the Queen of Scotland. I've never set eyes on her, but if I could get a glimpse of your picture, I should reckon it a great honour. Well, he hesitated for a bit, and then he took me in my working clothes into the castle apartments, past the guard, explaining I was the carpenter, and into a room where it hung. It was a good un, a big picture, large as life and as true, maybe, although she wasn't as purty as I expected. What has she got on? Asked Dame Cicely. I always wonder what kind of clothes queens and all uncommon mortals wear. Master Anthony has a white satin doublet for court, and a deal of trouble I had cleaning away a grease spot from the sleeve. Her clothes were finer done than her face, for I expects Master Audrey was cleverer at them, being his trade, so to speak. She had black drop earrings, and a black jet beadwork on her bosom, and a fine ruff edged with point lace. It had a bunch of pearls to fasten it, not ribbons like ordinary folk. There was a gold crucifix hanging by a velvet ribbon from her neck, and a cross and beads at her girdle, all painted, glittering, real as life. There was a cloak of lawn on her shoulders, not for warmth, just for beauty, all transparent and made very soft and light. Well, you've seen something we others haven't seen, observed Dame Cicely, and the others all began to talk of the Queen, and her sorrows, and her captivity, arguing and quarrelling among themselves. I went out of the house by the great porch, and round by the church. I passed into the yew walk, and beyond it I saw Francis. "Ho, Penelope, did you hear me call you?" he asked. "Did you know I wanted you?" And he swung his long legs over the wall and came to meet me. "Penelope, you are dressed like a princess, like a Spanish princess at court. Where's your boy garb?" He looked at me admiringly as I stood shyly waiting, at my best green dress with the hanging sleeves, and my dark hair tied with a green ribbon. He put his arms akimbo and began to sing a song to me, half mocking, half joyful, as if he were glad to see me again. Green sleeves was all my joy, green sleeves was my delight. Green sleeves was my heart of gold, and who but Lady Green Sleeves? Thy gown was of the grassy green, with sleeves of satin hanging by, which made thee be our harvest queen, and yet thou wouldst not love me. Green sleeves was all my joy, green sleeves was my delight. Green sleeves was my heart of gold, and who but Lady Green Sleeves? That's the latest London song, he informed me, which Anthony brought back with him. Then he called me to follow him, and he promised me we would have fine sport. There were owls' nests to find, and deer to watch, and the great bull to tease. He would fetch his hawks, and let me see them bring down a bird from the sky. He had a new falcon named Hover, and I should have it for my own. He would fetch his bow, and shoot an arrow which would cleave the white wand set in the far fields for the Sunday games. Did I know of Robin Hood? He asked. Yes, I've read the ballads of Robin Hood and Little John, I told him. You shall be made merry into my Robin Hood, said Francis. He lived in Sherwood Forest, not 50 miles away. I'll show you a great hollow oak where I keep my hunting knife, so that I can cut up the deer I slay. I'll give you a pair of antlers after my next kill. He promised sport indeed if I could come away to the woods, just as I was in my green dress. I shook my head. I came because you called, I said. It was for Anthony's locket. Did he tell you? The Queen herself gave it to him, and he would rather lose his right hand than her gift. I explained that I didn't know where it was. I had no powers. I was no witch girl. But you see into the future, he protested. Can't you see it lying somewhere? Can't you find it, Penelope? Even as he spoke, he grew shadowy and dim before my eyes. His hand slipped from my arm. The warmth of his voice, the new friendliness of his glance ebbed to nothing. I heard his voice again, vainly whispering, Penelope, don't go. Penelope. but mingled with it was the triumphant hymn which rang from the old church across the grass plat. "O God, our help in ages past," they sang. The cedar tree had vanished, the yew hedge had gone like vapor, and only the old oak tree and the mighty yews remained as witnesses of the past. "O God, our help." The words seemed to be uttered by the great tower itself, which had stood sentinel for generations, shadowing the rich and humble ones who stood by its walls, asking for aid against unseen foes. I looked up at that emblazoned tower, and said a prayer for those other ones, who were near to trouble. Then I went indoors, knowing I was going to my real home, and not the kitchen of long ago, with its tumult and anxiety over the Scottish Queen. By the fireside, in his armchair, sat my uncle. A long-handled spoon was in his hand, and he basted the sirloin, just as the boy Jude had turned the spit in other days. "What, are you all right, my dear?" he smiled at me. "Come and sit by an old man, and I'll tell you a tale as I thought on. A tale that's been simmering in my mind many a year, and may never come to light." So he talked of the woods, and a curious happening there, and soon the others came home from church. The tale ended. I was quite well. It was only a faintness from standing so long, they said, and I agreed with them.